Today, I'm going to talk about Ukraine again, but I would like to focus today about a narrative that I increasingly see in the media, which is that, oh, it's Trump who lost us the war, was going to lose us the war. And others saying, no, it's not Trump, it's the betrayal comes from the Europeans. I say this is exactly the wrong way to see about this, to think about this. This isn't a betrayal story. This is a very different story altogether. The reason I wanted to talk about this betrayal story is there was a story the other day, a column in The Guardian by Simon Tisdall. And, there is sort of a tendency in the media, I see, very much to put blame games on things. Why is Keir Starmer failing? Because of McSweeney. It's all him. He is to blame. And why is Labour failing? It's because of Keir Starmer. And the blame game narrative, convenient as it may be, never, this is my long experience in journalism, never explains why something is happening. Now, the reason in UK politics why Labour is failing is not related primarily to the leader. It's related to the party, the fact that this party doesn't know what it wants. And the Ukraine war has very similar characteristics. Now, when the war started in February 2022, there was an initial expectation that Ukraine might actually win it. In the beginning, obviously, everyone thought Russia would just walk over, but that didn't happen. And then Ukraine rebuffed Russia very successfully. And in that period, and I'd say the first 6 months, there were expectations that Ukraine might actually drive Russia back out of the occupied territories. And some people even thought that Ukraine might drive Russia out of Crimea, so that Russia would actually end up with less than what it started. Already by the autumn of that year, this sort of narrative became harder to sustain because the Russians were digging in, and it became very improbable at the time. Electorates, both in the United States and Europe, started to become more skeptical. People had already, by that time, 6 months into the war, gotten tired of it. They wanted something, they wanted a success story, and that wasn't a success story. So people moved on. So when we're talking about betrayal here, we're really talking about, we're criticizing voters. We're criticizing voters for not following your agenda, basically. It's like criticizing voters for voting for Trump. Now, you can spend your time doing that, and whatever political views you might have, it's generally a waste of time to blame voters for voting for a particular party. The job in politics is to continue and to win the next election and maybe persuade voters, but that hasn't happened. That hasn't succeeded anywhere. The reasons why the Europeans are not supporting Ukraine by more than they do is to do also with voters. The Ukraine war has become a political issue in Germany. The previous German government withheld certain weapons categories, fearing that its voters might not approve. The current German government is more open to supporting Ukraine and has gone to greater length. It made real money available. It's a 2-digit billion sum. This is a lot of money. And it does deliver weapon systems, but it does not deliver the amount, both financially and in military goods, that Ukraine will need to defeat Russia. And the same is true of other countries. Germany spends more. The UK spends a lot as well. France hardly spends anything. Spain, Italy hardly spend anything. So it's essentially Germany and the UK trying to do this together. Germany and the UK cannot replace what America did. And even when America was still on board, it was not enough. Back in December, the European Council agreed a 90 billion package in loans to Ukraine, funded by a European debt instrument. So they couldn't even pay this out of their own cash. They had to actually raise debt for their help with Ukraine. 90 billion is kind of the minimum. This is the money economists had calculated Ukraine would need to fill the budget deficit. This is not really helping the country win the war. This isn't like 90 billion in military goods. This is 90 billion to repair electricity systems, to repair general budget shortfalls. This is not all war-related. A large part is war-related. It's not going to be enough to even match or even come close to matching the Russian defense spending, which is about 150 billion per year. So for us to outspend the Russians at the current rate is completely delusional. It's like, I think we are way like a factor of 1 to 10. We are not close to this. So we can't really talk about betrayal unless we make proposals to say, okay, we want to match Russia, we want to defeat Russia, but we need to actually raise taxes for that, or we need to cut social spending for that. Now, you will never read this this in those columns. You're certainly not in the Guardian that anyone would advocate, let's cut social spending to give money to Ukraine, because that is not something that they want. They want other people to do the fighting. They want other people to do the funding. This is somebody else's issue. They just want Ukraine to win. This is basically us taking the position of some backseat drivers of the fanboys in the football stadium to cheer our team. But we're not doing this. We're not bankrolling this. We're not fighting ourselves, because obviously we don't want to be in a war with Russia. We've demonstrated that we don't want to be in a war with Russia. We're not sending troops. Every government has had the same red lines. And in terms of funding, yes, we do what we can, but we don't do what it takes. And I think that is the fundamental difference. So it's really wrong to think about betrayal. And I always often think about these. I'm often careful about psychologizing certain political conflicts, but there is sort of I often come back to the stages of mourning, and anger and denial are very common stages, and you see this in political debates. When people see they're realizing is they're first in denial, and denial is a story. And we in the Econoclast have often talked about things, about people underestimating dangers. This is the denial phase. Now this blame game is the anger phase. Now we're angry that our team is losing, and we're angry. Someone must be to blame, and we blame Trump. Olaf Scholz was another guy we could all blame because he could have done more. Or we can blame Macron. He's always there to blame. And Keir Starmer can be blamed. We can always blame certain people. But frankly, that doesn't help us. It doesn't help Ukraine. It doesn't also help us understand what is happening. What is happening is that Ukraine, that a country that is not in the EU, a country that is not in NATO, is being ransacked by a power of which it was part 25 years ago, until 25 years ago. So there's a war going on. We have not accepted Ukraine into NATO, so we cannot defend Ukraine as effectively as would have been the case otherwise. I think that the right course of action to get out of this would be to cut a deal very much on the lines that they're negotiating at the moment. The main issue to be sorted is the land, whether Russia will get all of the Donbas or the current areas it occupies. What is the status of the land? What is the status of whether there's military representation in those disputed areas? We're talking ultimately in most cases, peace deals are struck according to the battle lines. That would always be my position. I don't think anyone should get something they don't have. If you want to be successful in the peace deals, take the reality that you have. It's not about the law. It's not about international law. It's not about right or wrong. If people say the only peace deal is one where Russia withdraws, okay, then you don't want a peace deal. You want victory. And the only way to get Russia to retreat is to defeat Russia. Forget about the rhetoric of peace deal in that case. You don't want peace. You want victory. And that's fine. But the hypocrisy is if you want victory, but you don't want to put the money up, you don't want to put the troops up, you don't want to put the support up. And that's sort of where the hypocrisy lies. So given the thing, and I'm taking this as given the politics of that. The politics isn't the politics of a government, it's the politics of our voters that have elected those governments. The preferences they've declared their preferences. Given those preferences, a peace deal is the best outcome that is achievable for this. And so the question then is, there may be a dispute left over 50 kilometers of land. I would not suggest that Ukraine just accept the Russian demands that it should get all of the Donbass. I think this is an unreasonable demand. Likewise, it would be also unreasonable to think that Russia should retreat from areas it has occupied, because that is not the reality of a peace deal. So in my views, it should be based on the current land. And it may be possible that there is no deal, that Russia may continue fighting. If that were the case, if Russia were to reject a peace deal, including a peace deal that the U.S. administration would find reasonable, then we should reconsider our position in respect of our support of Ukraine and massively step it up. This is not doable with the current level of support. So the decision we should make, and this is really, I'm bifurcating here. I'm saying either we go all in, or we will push Ukraine into a peace deal. And the question is, the all-in scenario is, we're ultimately talking about 50 kilometers of land. 50 kilometers of land and, hundreds of thousands of people who might die for it, trillions that it would cost us in money. Is this something we want? Is this something we are ready for? Because it's not up to Ukraine to decide this, as the Western position has always been. Because if you are the sponsor of this, if you're bankrolling this, you have a word here, and your voters have a word here. So this is something that needs to be on the table, and we need to discuss this more honestly. But I see we are sort of in this blame game scenario right now. This is sort of this, oh my God, how how did this happen? It's been happening for a while, and I think I've been sort of writing in columns myself that since about late 2022 that Ukraine is not going to win this war, and the situation hasn't changed much. This is a war of attrition, a border that is a battle line that's stuck. There is not going to be a breakthrough by either side. Russia is not going to run over the rest of the country. We've seen this. Ukraine's defenses have been strong enough to withstand that scenario. But equally, Ukraine is not strong enough to get a material amount of its lost territory back. So there's a stalemate. And a stalemate, Russia is the bigger army. Forget all the numbers about Russian casualties, they're lies. I heard Marco Rubio say the other day, Russia's losing 8,000 troops each week in the war. If that were the case, and if you do the math, they would have lost more than 1.6 million, which is larger than the size of the Russian army. You cannot lose, numbers like that are sort of lack credibility. Russia has had serious losses, but nothing of the kind. So we should not underestimate. And they're still big. They're still much, much bigger than Ukraine. Their army is a multiple of the size of Ukraine's. There's no way Ukraine is going to gain its territory back. I also don't think Russia will, succeed in its efforts either. So I think it is time for the Europeans in particular, but also for the U.S. administration is already negotiating this deal, but it's not likely to impose its own terms here. So this is very much a matter between the Ukraine and Russia. I think it is time for the Europeans to start talking to Putin, talking to Zelensky, and trying to put something on the table that would encourage both of them to cut a deal. At the moment, the Europeans are not doing that. At the moment, the Europeans are still making unreasonable demands. Unrealistic demands. It's not that they're unreasonable in some kind of theoretical sense, but they're not designed to end the war. If that were the goal, I don't think it is. And if the Europeans continue this process, they may find themselves the ultimate loser of this war.
Join the Econoclast for our first live show.
We're coming to London for one night only. Join me, Wolfgang Munchau.
And me, Yanis Varoufakis, in the heart of British power in Westminster for a live recording, Q&A and book signing.
We're looking forward to smashing some myths and meeting our listeners.
Predominantly, we're going to be discussing, is Russia really a threat for Europe and the United Kingdom?
And asking which powers are set to dominate the new world disorder.
So join us and go to unherd.com/Econoclast to get your tickets now.
They're already selling out fast, so don't miss out.
Well, like you, I am not just reluctant, but loath to speak of betrayal. Betrayal is a word that should be used very judiciously. The expression I would use, Wolfgang, is that the people of Ukraine were led down the garden path by the West, by Europe, and by various administrations in the United States, but particularly by Europe. And I will even go as far as to say that the whole point was to lead them down the garden path and leave them there alone. Look, in 2008, 2009, it was already clear that NATO was intent on expanding into Georgia and into Ukraine in particular. Now, look at the map of the Black Sea. Crimea was part of, formally, after 1991, of Ukraine. It so happens that it was also the major port of the Russian Navy. There was an arrangement where Sevastopol was allowed to remain the Russian Navy's main base. Now, when you're saying that we're going to induct Ukraine into NATO, whether you like it as an idea or you don't like it doesn't matter. What you're effectively saying is you're going to encase the Russian Navy within NATO territory. How well is that going to go down in Moscow? Okay, number one. Number two, I'm not going to go into the analysis of what happened in Maidan in 2014 and the overthrow of Yanukovych and the new regime and so on. The fact is that in 2014, there was an attempt ethnically to cleanse Russians from the eastern parts of Ukraine. when the government effectively bans Russian from schools in an area where Russian is the main language. And you have Europe that has a long tradition of double standards. Remember that, essentially, the rights of Russian speakers in the Baltic states were effectively trampled upon. That was, we are supposed to be a European Union that respects the rights of minorities, that respects the rights to self-determination, to self-expression, and so on and so forth. We have not been very good at that. Even when it came to former Yugoslavia. I was absolutely appalled, as I'm sure you were, by the ethnic cleansing, by the Srebrenica massacre, by what the Chetniks were doing on the one side and the Ustashi were doing on the other side, or there in Yugoslavia. But, Europe had double standards. Brussels and Berlin and Paris, even Athens, were quite happy, or at least tolerant, of when Serbs were being cleansed, and less so when Croats or Muslims were being served. So, we have not been very good at maintaining our own moral values as Europeans. And when it came to Ukraine, essentially, the powers that be in Europe gave a blank check to Ukrainian authorities that they are going to be inducted into NATO without explaining what is going to happen if, I'm not justifying this. People say, this is accepting the talking points of Putin. This is not a moral judgment. What you're saying is you're going to take the Russian fleet and you're going to encase it by NATO in Crimea. Now, if you did this in the United States, if Mexico were to join some Chinese military alliance, I don't believe that the Americans would be happy with San Diego to be encased by a Chinese version of NATO. And you have to ask yourself your question. If you make that move, if you support the Ukrainians to enter into NATO and essentially to encase Sevastopol within NATO territory, what are you going to do if the Russian bear, responds the way it did? You need to think it through. Are you going to start a war with Russia? Will you stand, as you were saying, will you send troops? Will you escalate? Because if you're not prepared to do that, then what is the point of talking legalistically about the right of Ukraine to be a member of NATO? No, nobody has the right to start a third world war. Nobody has the right, like Mexico doesn't have the right to jeopardize world peace by, allowing in a Chinese military base in Tijuana. Legally, they have the right to do it. I do not recognize the right of my friend Claudia Scheinbaum to plant a Chinese military base, naval base, in Tijuana if that jeopardizes world prospects. More generally speaking, this whole notion that, as you said it very well, that you cannot reward Putin by striking a peace agreement. That has been the argument now since 2022. Whenever, you, me, others have been proposing peace plans, you proposed one just now, me and colleagues of mine from DN25, for instance, we've been arguing, this is something that we did in March of 2022. We put forward an idea. Maybe it's not a good idea, but it is an idea. For instance, take the Donbas. What happens to the Donbas? Well, the Donbas, in my eyes, is reminiscent, of course there are many differences, but it's quite reminiscent of Northern Ireland. It is a part of the world where you've got two populations with very different understandings of the traditions of what is at stake. There is a lot of conflict, but they are very similar at the same time. They have strong roots in the same village, on the same land. And we know what the solution to the troubles was in Northern Ireland. It was a Good Friday Agreement where you have quasi-joint sovereignty by London and by Dublin. Every community has two leaders. One comes from Sinn Féin, the other comes from the Protestants, right? And you try to find some way. So there are creative ways of doing this. But I remember when we were DM25 and myself, we were putting this forward. The attacks that I was receiving on the basis that any such talk is appeasement. You're appeasing, you're rewarding the aggressor. Well, You know, either, as you said, either you're suing for peace or you're going for victory. And they're doing neither. And if we want to bring out the word betrayal, which I am very reluctant, like you are, to bring out, I will do it in this way. The greatest betrayal by our leadership in Europe, of Europe, not just for Ukraine, is that they have no concept of a new security arrangement for Europe that will include and incorporate ultimately and potentially Russia. They have no idea of what they want. If you really push them, in the end, you end up with a picture that they paint similar to the Korean Peninsula. You know, the coalition of the willing. What on earth are they thinking of? That there is going to be a line of control somewhere across the Donbas with parts of Zaporizhia or with parts of Kherson and so on, and that the Europeans are going to have an army that will play the role there along that line of control similar to that of the Americans in the Korean Peninsula. Firstly, they can't do it, even if they want to. And secondly, they shouldn't want to do it. This is not, the Korean Peninsula solution is not a good solution for Ukraine. An alternative security arrangement, which includes, coming to terms with, a Moscow that you may dislike very intensely. That's the whole point about a peace deal. It should leave everyone slightly dissatisfied.
There are two sort of big obstacles to any peace deals, and we are basically, putting these big obstacles in place. One is history, the idea of what is our historic right, and this is not how peace deals work. Peace deal basically accepts, solutions that are anti-historic. They often accept the cutting of land, the cutting of regions into look at Karelia between Finland and Russia. Karelia was, when the Winter War 1939-1940 ended, Karelia was split into a Russian and a Finnish part. When Germany was separated, it wasn't separated on clean regional lines. It cut through regions that previously belonged together. That always happens. The second thing that's really against peace is sort of this legalistic thinking that we have sort of developed in the West. The idea that Putin has to be dragged in front of the ICC and be condemned. You're not going to get a deal if that is your priority. We are basically in the West not having fought wars, mercifully, but we are basically sitting here talk about war all the time. None of us is fighting, has ever fought, and we're taking sort of legalistic views. We're saying, okay, we have to, these are war crimes. This is genocide. This is, we be putting categories on it, but these categories are a problem for peacemakers, because I cannot make peace with somebody who I, after the peace deal, I want to drag in front of an international court. I cannot make a deal with somebody of whom I demand reparations. I mean, the EU is still demanding that Russia pays reparations, which is not a peace deal scenario. It's a defeat scenario. Mm-hmm. So the only way you have to win the war first before you can extract reparations payments. So I think
people don't want to fight, though, right?
Absolutely. They are confused. You're absolutely right to say we're not doing enough for war, we're not doing enough for peace. This is the absurdity of the position. In previous days, when you had wars, it was your country that would fight the war, it was you who would go to war, it was your children that would go to war, and it was your taxes that would pay for the war. But we are now in the situation where we don't go to war, our children don't go to war in the West. No, we don't pay for the war with our money. We try to sequester Russian assets or let the Americans pay for it. This has been sort of a very different experience, and we are much more gung ho about the war because it has no costs to us. If the outcome cannot be peace, and if the outcome cannot be victory, it's a deeply immoral position to take, because you're ultimately just going into a process. You're saying this is fine. We haven't got an idea. We haven't got a clue how to end this, but maybe we'll think of something someday. That's the situation where we are today. It's about, Russia will exhaust itself. This is sort of the ultimate excuse that they have, that our sanctions, 20th sanctions package was now being discussed, that eventually it will break Russia's back. It won't. It hasn't. The 19 didn't happen. The 20s won't happen, because Russia is aligned with China, is aligned with North Korea, and it is aligned with Iran, as we're now seeing as well. And therefore, I believe it's time to throw some of these principles overboard and say, look, we need to, if you want to get a peace deal done, the only country able to do a peace deal at the moment is the United States. I think the best outcome or the best chance we could have is that the talks at the moment are not going anywhere, but they are sufficiently advanced that we could get to a position where the US imposes its own peace deal on both sides. If Russia were to accept and Ukraine were to reject, we would be in a scenario where the United States would then presumably cut off whatever aid it still gives to Ukraine. So I think that is a potential scenario for peace. But if that scenario were to fail, and the timeline is, if it were to fail, it will probably have to fail by May or June, because then we're in the realm of the US congressional elections. We would be in a very, very difficult scenario, and the Europeans would have to grow. It would basically be on their watch, and they would have to kind of find a solution. But if they don't, and I would always assume they don't, because they haven't got anybody at the top who thinks strategically about these things, as we just did. And we just think strategically means just think beyond next week, beyond the next press release or next declaration, but actually think about how does this end? Where does it leave us? What is the implication for our own security? What's the implication for our finances? What is the implication for the geopolitical makeup? That's the kind of stuff they should be discussing. But if they don't, then we could enter very bad scenarios.
What you just described is a dereliction of duty by Europe, if not a betrayal of Europe, not of Ukraine, but of itself. Because if we rely on Trump to find a good solution for Ukraine and for Europe, that will never happen. There may be a solution, but it won't be good for Europe. It will be awful for all of us and for the Ukrainians, and we only have our European leadership and ourselves to blame for it.